she calls experience of continued presence.
She used to lie on the couch and she used to sleep there. After the funeral, I wanted to feel close to her. So I didn't do that before, but I lied on the couch. I just to feel the connection again with her. I was half asleep, half awake. I sensed her next to me. Actually, I didn't just sense her next to me.
I've been investigating experiences of continuing presence in grief, and this is where a bereaved person feels or senses someone close to them that has died and senses that they're still around in some way. And this can take the form of a voice, hearing their familiar voice, or it can be through a vision, or a sense of touch, or smelling, or sometimes it can be a more general sense that the person is still with them.
Just start putting, she's quite upset actually, and stressed, saying, this is my couch, this is where I lie, come on, stand up, wake up, stand up, this is my place, this is my couch. And I just, opened my eyes, wasn't asleep by him, and she disappeared.
In terms of the character of these experiences, they can range very much from everyday, mundane kind of occurrences. So, for example, somebody hearing a compliment about their new haircut from someone who's died. Or it can be very highly emotionally charged experiences and can bring up a very raw grief.
It felt real. It wasn't dreamlike, it wasn't hallucinatory because I was grieving, I was in a lot of pain, but I think I was corpus mentis and I wasn't losing the sense of reality. It was as if I see you now. I could almost touch her, and her touching me it felt real. I mean, I could sense her finger on me, and that was, what created this sense of also a little bit of unease, the reality of that. It felt like she was really there. There was nothing different, and actually, in many respects, this is something that Maria would have done if she was alive. She would come on and say, "Come on, stand up. This is my couch."
When we examine the properties, what we call the phenomenology of these experiences, we found that not many of them actually related to memory in terms of being a simple repetition of a memory. They had new features.
Second time I saw her was, I just woke up and was going down the stairs. I saw her, sitting on the stairs, crying. And I said, "Maria," and she turned. And I asked her, "What's wrong, darling?" She said nothing, and she left.
Some people reported a feeling of presence of the person that died could at times be so real and so vivid that it brought the person right back there, and then they would have to lose them in the next moment and grieve them again.
I felt really troubled by her distress, more than any, for a long time I contemplated whether a friend of mine who's a Buddhist said that, I could perform a ritual, and, I am not a religious person, but then again, I have a kind of open mind. So there was this sense of him giving me a kind of solution to her transitioning, which for a long time I struggled with, because I also wanted her to be there. I mean, however distressing or distressing was, I selfishly wanted her to stay. It felt like I was experiencing another loss, and then at the end, I decided, yes, I mean, we need to do this ritual, and from then on, after the ceremony, I haven't seen her again. And it was really difficult. I had to let her go, and you know, I wished she would come back again, but she hasn't.
Grief does share all sorts of what can feel like alarming experiences to things that you wouldn't normally have strong emotional reactions to. Discuss those things openly. Then they can be pulled apart. You know, what is this doing? What's really the practical effect on my life of this? You know, no matter what we think about this on an ontological level for a minute, this is something that has a very strong sense of reality for me. In fact, it might be even stronger, the sense of reality I have, than other things that are happening to me in the wider world at the moment.
I feel intensely her presence inside me, but I just wish that I could see her again, even for a second. You think of the myth of Orpheus, essentially, him going to the underworld, trying to get Eurydice back. I often thought to myself before I lost Maria, how on earth was it possible that he got the love of his life back, and the only thing he had to do was not to look at her again until they were out of the underworld. But then he turned and he loses her. And I thought, for the love of God, why did you do that? How on earth was it possible to get her out of the underworld, but then lose her twice, by just turning and looking at her for a split second? But I could get it now. I mean, the desire to see her for a second and then lose her again, it's there. A brief encounter like that, just one moment. She will be gone forever again. But it's just you know, having that, it's so valuable. And I don't think that I was able to get this myth before, this sort of story before of Orpheus, until I experienced loss myself.
Really?
Yeah, I really get it. In many ways, even if it is an illusion, we need our illusions. We cannot live without them. They help us transition from a space where you are with someone, you are spending every day of your life with them, to a space that you are not with them.
That was made for us by Edward Lawrence. When someone you love is gone, you still carry them with you. We hold each other's eternities in our memory.
Shortcuts is presented by Choosing Long, and the series producer is Eleanor McDowell. The program is a Falling Tree production for BBC Radio 4.
I mean, sort of like a glass box, really. I see life going on around me, but I can't break free from that.
Young or old, we're all likely to experience it at some point in our lives.
It is incredibly lonely.
But what does loneliness actually mean?
Loneliness impacts sleep, Loneliness also impacts depressive symptoms and feelings of sadness, and it impacts your social relationships.
This week, Claudia Hammond launches the Loneliness Experiment.
An attempt to find the causes and possible solutions to this problem.
All in the Mind, the Loneliness Experiment. Tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 on BBC Radio 4.
Now, the insect researcher Adam Hart lifts the lid on one of the more controversial aspects of his field of science. Why do entomologists kill large numbers of insects in their line of work, and how do they justify this?
So in here I've got a jar. This is called a killing jar. It's got it labelled killing jar. At the bottom of it I've got plaster of Paris. That's because it absorbs the liquid that I put in there while it turns into a gas. This is our killing fluid here. I only need a tiny drop of this in there, and this is sealed, it's airtight. It's quite a small killing jar because obviously I want to kill these insects as quick as possible. It's not something that I take any pleasure in, and I want it done as ethically, correctly and quickly as I possibly can. They will actually be dead within seconds.
Entomologist Sally Ann Spence uses a traditional killing jar to kill the dung beetles she collects for her studies. Other insect scientists pop their subjects into the deep freeze, while some of us go for death by alcohol.
We'd like them to make a very simple wasp trap and hang it up in their garden and then send us their wasps.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, all you need is...
This is my colleague Syrian Sumner from University College London on BBC One's Country File at the end of last summer. She was launching our Big Wasp Survey, a nationwide citizen science project we devised to survey the distribution and abundance of the UK's 8 species of social wasp.
About half a can of lager in the bottom, so about 200 mils.
So that's ready to go, so the wasps will be flooding into this.
They will flood into that.
So wasps aren't going to die in the name of science. Does that bother you at all?
Not really, because the impact that these traps are going to have on wasp populations will be negligible.
We were very excited. We don't actually know that much about how social wasps are being affected by environmental change, but we do know that they're very important as pollinators and as predators of pests. But with bees getting all the media attention and wasps being, well, not exactly popular, wasp research doesn't generally get much of a look in. We believed we could get some new, important data, but the headlines in some national newspapers told us that not everyone was as excited about the project as we were.
Conservationists slam hateful survey promoting wasp killing.
Public urged to drown wasps in beer in bizarre conservation project.
Criticism and abuse on social media rapidly followed, although plenty of scientists were quick to jump to our defence. The negative reaction to what I've always regarded as absolutely vital, the killing of insects to collect and study them, was a bit of a shock. It got me thinking, can we really defend the deaths of millions of insects for the sake of science? Indeed, does the science ever justify what some on social media described as a slaughter? Especially when we're so concerned about insect conservation. How do we feel about killing our subjects? And might insects themselves be feeling something akin to pain? To begin to answer some of these questions, I visited the lab at University College London, to which members of the public have sent the wasps they trapped in the first week of last September.
So inside this freezer, you can just have a look. You can see it's full of envelopes.
Yes.
Yeah, full of envelopes that have all been sent by people from all over the country. And if we just take one out, for example, we can see that they've got the trap number, and I can look at that on our database and see exactly where in the country that's come from.
Peggy Bevan and Susie Warnock are students working with Syrian Sumner to identify the different species in the 2,000 or so trap contents sent in. Unfortunately, these mass surveys are something you just can't do with live wasps.
Okay. Definitely some wasps in here. So just we'll pick it out with some forceps to try and separate it from a few of the flies that are in there.
Can you identify them for us, or do you need a bit more work with these?
I think that one is vulgaris. It has the anchor-shaped marker.
Yeah, because you need to get up close, don't you, and actually look at the features to see which of course is going to be very difficult to do with a live wasp.
Yeah, there's absolutely no way that I'd be able to identify them if they were alive.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the questions we had from people inquiring about the Big Wasp survey. Couldn't we ask them to send in photos instead? I'd love to be able to say yes, but sadly, the quality of the photo that you could get from a live wasp passing through your garden is just not good enough. And also, even though the face markings are quite indicative of the species, you do need to verify the markings on the back of the thorax as well in order to be 100% certain of the species identity.
Insects are small and tricky to identify. To get the data we needed, we had to have the wasps from all over the UK under a microscope. So what was the big problem that people had with our survey? Chief among our critics was Matt Charlotte, Chief Executive of the invertebrate conservation charity Buglife.
I guess the two main things that worried us about that project was that it started with a slogan that said that harnessing the hatred of the British public for the wasp, and as an organisation that doesn't hate wasps, that was quite difficult for us to
Все серебро на ремонт уходит.
trying to encourage people to understand and
Поднял серебра, починился, нет серебра.
wasps rather than get into conflict situations.
Постоянный ремонт.
A difficult phrase to deal with, and I think you got us, onto the wrong foot.
We took your point on board about harnessing the hatred. In fact, we got rid of that strapline before that website went public.
We then had a hard look at the scientific rationale for the project, because when you're looking at killing life, insects or any other animals, we think that that should be carefully justified. So there's no absolutes here, there are grey areas, and in that grey area, we would say if you've got a really good reason for killing the invertebrates, for instance, if killing that invertebrate means you can then save 100,000 other invertebrates, then as Spock on Star Trek might say, the value of that one life has to give way to the value of the many other lives. But in this case, when we looked at the reasons why insects were going to be killed, primarily wasps and some other things, the scientific rationale didn't seem carefully enough worked out for us to believe that the outcome in terms of data and knowledge justified the amount of killing of insects that would be going on.
Naturally, we didn't agree with Matt. For example, we minimised the impact on wasp populations by surveying at a time of year when the wasps flying around were likely to be non-reproductive worker wasps towards the end of their lives.
Как я промазал, вообще интересно.
In total, we estimate the project will, as we predicted,
Не пробил, он крепкий такой.
To put that into context, pest controllers every year destroy thousands of nests in people's rooms and sheds. While the Big Wasp survey might have had its detractors for killing a few thousand insects, one of the most reported and lauded scientific discoveries of last year entailed the deaths of millions.
Scientists in Germany have reported what they describe as an alarming drop in the population of flying insects.
You might remember it. Research over the last quarter of a century in Germany revealed a staggering 75% decline in the overall mass of flying insects. Dave Goulson of the University of Sussex was one of the authors.
This is really serious. Insects are vitally important. They make up the bulk of life on Earth. They do all sorts of things that we can't do without, like pollinating, being food for most birds and bats and so on. So if that study hadn't taken place, we'd be sitting here with no idea quite what a crisis was looming.
But to find out that insects were declining so dramatically required insect death on a grand scale. More than 50 kilograms worth died in the course of the study.
The way that the insects were sampled was using a thing called a malaise trap, or actually dozens of malaise traps dotted all over Germany. And malaise trap, it looks a bit like a two-man bridge tent. It's basically a couple of poles and a load of netting, and insects bump into it as they're flying about. And when they hit it, they tend to hit the netting, they tend to walk upwards, and it's kind of designed at the top a bit like a lobster pot. They fall into a pot of alcohol, and they die. They catch pretty much all flying insects, so butterflies, moths, bees, wasps, flies, all sorts of things. So the entomologist puts the trap up, and then he just comes back 24 hours later and empties the pot. Personally, I hate malaise traps because they catch so much, but in this instance, the data that have been produced are incredibly important and valuable, and have caused people around the world to some of them notice. And to try and take some perspective on it, the number of insects we kill would be an infinitesimally small proportion of the number of insects in Germany. Much as it makes me uncomfortable killing one insect if you don't have to, there are times when I think you just have to accept that the benefit outweighs the harm. So long as you're careful in how you design your experiment, you minimise the harm.
A chilly January day is not ideal for collecting insects, but I did stand some chance on the downland pasture of Wiltshire in the company of Sally Ann Spence.
There are cattle in this field, next to cattle.
And where there are cowpats and sheep dung, there should be dung beetles.
This is quite fresh dung, but in the summertime, fresh dung would already be colonised straight away by dung flies and other insects coming straight in. But what I'm doing is I'm picking up some dung and I'm what we call hand searching it.
You're picking through it with your fingers.
I'm literally picking through it with my fingers. So I've got some gloves on. We do have interactive dung beetles, which is what I'm looking for.
When I think of dung beetles, I'm generally thinking of big, black, scarab beetles, basically. You're picking through this dung in quite fine detail. We're looking for something a little bit different from what I'm imagining.
The real big, chunky scarab beetles that you're talking about we have, they tend to live in tunnels underneath the dung. Most of our dung beetles, actually our biggest group of dung beetles, actually live in the dung itself.
How many different species of dung beetle have we got here?
Well, we've got over 40 different species of dung beetles.
Ну, арту я вынес.
Exact, because
Что-то пытались тут
dung beetles
сделать.
is we don't know actually how well they're doing. We know that some are definitely getting rarer than others. We're presuming some are now extinct because we cannot find them at the moment. But this is the beginning of a project that we're setting up just to basically understand how many dung beetles we've got, what the population frequencies are, where they are in the UK, and what state they're in. So we've got basically a data sort of foundation line to understand more about the species.
This is an ongoing survey run by Oxford University's Museum of Natural History. Dung beetles are very useful insects. They're the first step in getting the nutrients bound up in dung back into the ecosystem. With less dung hanging around for less time, it's also less able to harbour parasites that can harm our livestock. But each dung beetle species has a different niche and a subtly different ecological role, which is why Sally Ann needs to collect and identify at multiple sites around the country. Now, some species she can ID at the cowpat, but others she has to take back to the lab, where the beetles go into the killing jar we met earlier. Then it's under the microscope for identification, which can be rather more involved and X-rated than you might think.
It doesn't always stop on the external factors of a beetle. With dung beetles, as with many beetles, they basically can have very different willies from each other as well. So sometimes it may be necessary to remove that willy, because the willy comes out of the body, it's got an exoskeleton, which means it doesn't degrade with the rest of the soft tissues. We have books full of drawings, very, very graphic, if you like, very specific drawings of dung beetle willies. I can possibly tell different species by that. I cannot unfortunately do that with the animal alive.
Once you've identified that animal, what happens to its body then?
Its body is not thrown away. That's one thing that's really, really important. That animal is then mounted on a pin. Pins are put in after the animals are dead, and we use the pin for many reasons, because that specimen is going to be kept for infinity. So that individual will be kept on a pin, and it will have its immediate data attached to that pin. So that individual is literally with its data within the museum facility. But I do need to have those individuals because I need to be absolutely 100% certain of what species it is, because it can be looking very similar to another beetle, but have an effect on a totally different part of the environment around it. And these specimens are kept for infinity, and they can be accessed for many different uses. So it might be somebody who's studying the effects of that particular species on parasites in livestock and breaking down the dung, or it could be for climatical change, or it can be for a myriad of reasons, and more reasons in the future that I might not have thought of now in my lifetime. Whoever comes back in 50 years' time into that collection can actually access the individual that I picked up in that field, and all the data I've had that day when I collected it. It is there, it is definite, hard evidence, and that's really important for the baseline of data. We don't know what we're losing until we know what we've got.
That's a message that echoes all around the vast entomology department at London Natural History Museum. Just the beetle collection contains around 10 million specimens. As it stands, there are about 400,000 different beetle species described by scientists, But according to senior beetle curator Max Barkley, there are many more out there to be discovered. The bodies of species new to science are coming into the museum all the time, and these specimens are particularly important. Max showed me some of the latest from a recent West African expedition.
Running down the middle of the tray here are the most amazing looking, well, weevils I'm guessing, but they're beautiful ruby red iridescents with these turquoise kind of green lines across them. They're one of the most beautiful beetles I've ever seen. I noticed they have a red label under them. Is that significant?
The red label is very significant, actually. It indicates that those are type specimens. And a type specimen is the original specimen of a new species. So if you or I were to describe a species as new to science, we'd have to publish a paper explaining why it was new, and that would have to be peer-reviewed by the scientific community. So you set out your reasons that it's new, and you'd label some specimens up as type specimens, which are the ones that you had in front of you when you described the new species. So if you wanted to know what I was talking about when I gave a name to a species, in 100 years' time when I'm dead, you can go back and look at my type specimens and you can see, oh, that's what he had in mind, that's what he meant when he said it has a yellow stripe on its head. He meant that sort of yellow stripe, not this sort of yellow stripe. So the type specimens are the vouchers of the new species and back up that set of characters that define that new species in a public institution where they can be consulted for all time.
For Max Barkley, the collection of insects by institutions like the Natural History Museum is really a race against time to build up an archive of our vanishing biodiversity.
Unfortunately, human influence is spreading over the planet at a very great rate. The population is rising, of course, and the amount of natural habitat is going to decrease. And I always think of it as almost one is working with an art gallery which is on fire, and one is trying to rescue as much of the information of at least what the paintings and sculptures were before they are destroyed. And this is effectively what we're doing, is we're going into these habitats and we're collecting specimens and we're archiving individual specimens that represent species that are present in the natural habitats. And in 150 years' time, 200 years' time, who knows whether those species will still exist.
I think one of the things that people struggle with when they come into the museum and they see the numbers is just the sheer volume of insects, if you like, that we collect as part of science. How would you justify to someone who looks at a tray like this and feels sort of disgust, if you like, at the loss of life?
It's a difficult question. It's important, I think, to emphasize the value that a collection like this has and offset that against the loss of individual insect lives. I mean, all of us in this business, we love insects. We don't like killing things. Nobody actually enjoys going out and killing things. But in terms of numbers, the amount of insects that we collect on an expedition is fewer than are killed on the windscreen of your car if you drive from London to Edinburgh in the summer. If the habitat's in good condition and it's not degraded, insects exist in enormous numbers. They're at the bottom of the food chain. Insects are robust to predation. This is really just a form of predation. The number of entomologists in the world is really very, very small compared to the number of birds and the number of people who can drive long distance.
Insect collections are archives of immense scientific value. We can even dip into old specimens to analyse their DNA. But for some people, it isn't just a question of ensuring that we don't endanger species or populations with our collecting. What if individual insects suffer pain or distress? We may never know for sure, but a few researchers are now leaning towards giving insects the benefit of the doubt. In Australia, entomologist Andrew Barron and his colleague Colin Klein, a philosopher of neuroscience at the Australian National University, are making this argument. Colin Klein.
In particular, what we're finding is that a lot of the kind of computational machinery in an insect brain bears a striking similarity, or this is our argument, to computational machinery in the human brain, and that machinery supports consciousness in humans. Now, of course, an insect brain is much, much smaller, and in some sense, you know, an insect is not going to have a very rich inner life. But the idea that it might feel something, so it might have visual sensations, it might feel something like pain or hunger or thirst, that, I think, Andrew and I have argued this, that seems to be increasingly plausible.
So what's your argument for some sort of sense of insect consciousness based on?
There's a kind of two-step argument. So first, what we argue is that in the human brain, there are structures which refer to as the midbrain, And although this is controversial, it seems that those are the structures that really support the basic capacity for consciousness in humans. Given that, and then we go and we look at the insect brain and we say, look, the kind of information integration that's going on in the insect brain seems to be very similar to what's going on in the human midbrain.
How do we make that jump from looking at insect brain structures to actually making some form of statement about their subjective experience?
One of the interesting things about both the human midbrain and the insect central complex and brain more broadly is a particular kind of information integration. It looks like this structure integrates together information about the insect's visual world, the insect's own motion. It integrates information about bodily needs, along with stored memories. So these things come together, and the argument is that both in the midbrain of the human and the central complex of the insect, these things come together and give you something like, this is metaphorical, but I think it's important, something like a first-person perspective on the world. So you get all of these things, and then that's what allows, for example, sensory information to get something like meaning for the insect.
What would that mean in terms of an insect's ability to suffer pain, for example?
My own opinion on this is, if insects feel anything at all, and I think they do, then I think they probably feel pain. Pain, along with things like hunger or thirst, are among the very oldest and kind of evolutionarily most important sensations.
Insect physiologist Sherry Adamo at Dalhousie University in Canada is not convinced by these arguments about insect nervous systems and the existence of some kind of insect mind.
They do have complex neuroanatomy, so I don't want to make it sound like they have simple brains, because they have complex brains, but there's nothing in their brains that looks like what we have. So that doesn't mean that they don't have subjective feeling. It just makes it a lot harder to be able to say one way or the other what they have, because you can't really rely on analogous brain areas, say in a mammal.
If you do something to an insect which it doesn't like, say you prod it, for example, and it responds to it, it seems as though it might be sensing pain. But are you suggesting that we don't know enough about their brains, we don't understand enough to be able to say for sure that they're experiencing pain in the same way that we do?
It's a complicated problem. Insects, like all organisms on the planet, have the ability to withdraw from damage. So if something starts crushing its leg, it will move away, and sometimes it'll writhe, it'll do all sorts of things. All of these behaviors that they do help the animal to survive. And it's not just that they will have reflexes, they have more than that. Those sorts of damaging stimuli have long-term effects on their behavior and can be motivators for learning. And it's that sort of evidence that started people thinking maybe they have some sort of subjective experience. The difficulty that I have with that argument is that on the other side, we now have robots and artificial intelligence, and some robots, in fact, that are designed based on some of the neural principles insects use, that can kind of do the same thing. And we don't think they're feeling any particular pain, even though they look like, they mimic the type of behavior that we have when we're in pain. So I think just having behavior that looks superficially like pain behavior to us, I think it's not really a very compelling argument that insects themselves have some sort of subjective experience, because we have counterexamples.
We see insects doing amazing things, but do we also see insects doing things that really make us question whether or not they're feeling pain or suffering in any way?
Well, we certainly do see behaviors that make us wonder, at least in some species, whether they feel pain, or that their concept of pain must be very different. So, for example, some insects will continue to use a damaged limb, so they'll continue to try to walk on the stump of a leg. Grasshoppers have been shown to continue to eat while something's eating them from the other end, so the praying mantis is chewing them on one end and they're chewing on grass at the other end. And cockroaches and a few other insects, if you open them or they get damaged, they will eat their own innards. I've even seen that myself with cockroaches. It's sort of disturbing, but they will. And that's something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in animals that have a keen sense of distress, I would think.
I think I have to agree that eating your own guts doesn't seem a promising sign of sentience. But what if we can't completely rule out the possibility that insects are sentient? Should we be rethinking how we treat them? Colin Klein again.
Professor Bob Fisher has argued even if there's a sense in which there's only a very small chance that insects are conscious, the fact that we kill so many of them ought to give you at least a little bit of pause. I'm not sure what the consequences of this are. You know, I'll be honest, I still readily kill cockroaches. I have been trying to be better about shepherding spiders out, even the really nasty Australian ones. I mean, one way that I've been thinking about it, at least for researchers, is that insofar as something is conscious, it does give you, at least, you ought to have at least something like an attitude of reverence sounds quite strong, but at least respect or appreciation.
This sentience question is one of the ones that dominates a lot of the legal approaches to animal welfare. So whether something suffers pain or not is an important question, I guess, but I actually don't think it's the biggest question when it comes to invertebrate life.
Matt Shardlow of Bug Life. His point is that all of us should respect insects, regardless of whether they're conscious or not.
I think some of it is about respect for other organisms. Now, whether they feel things the same way as us or not, I think to some level is actually irrelevant. The fact is that these are animals that are existing on the planet that are actually quite similar needs and basic modes of operation that we have. And at that basic level, I think they should be respected. Where does that fall down? Well, things, for instance, like the celebratory stuff which people in forests being forced to eat, you know, grubs. That is demeaning, not just for the individual involved, it's demeaning for the invertebrates. You know, these are important animals. They maintain balances of ecosystems, they recycle waste into new life, and here they are getting treated on a game show for light entertainment. And that sort of level of disrespect I find problematical.
Out of Sussex University's Dave Wilson, if he could bring in new rules or laws to protect insects, they wouldn't be focused on the welfare of individuals. They'd be about safeguarding populations in the wild.
Insects receive almost no protection of any sort, unlike most other larger forms of wildlife. So, for example, there's nothing to stop you going outside and catching and killing as many butterflies as you like, unless they're formally listed as an endangered species, and in the whole world there are only a handful of insects that are on that list, simply because nobody pays much attention to insects. Lists of endangered species are birds and mammals and so on. I guess it reflects our innate biases. You know, we value big fur and feathery things more than we do little insects, which is a shame, because one can make a pretty good argument that insects are more important, at least in terms of what they do in the environment, than some of these larger creatures that we seem to care more about.
Entomologists with their killing jars might seem like relics of the Victorian age, but with insects under threat, finding out more about what species are out there and their numbers has never been more important. And to do that, sadly, we do have to kill some to discover the impact we're having on these vital but disrespected animals. One thing's certain, entomologists don't put insects in the killing jar lightly, but we do make sure we extract every last ounce of value from the lives we take.
Inside the Killing Jar was presented by Adam Hart. The producer was Andrew Baker.
Let BBC Music start your summer.
Join us in May as we unite the nations in a weekend of live music.
Performing in Perth, Noel Gallagher, Nigel Kennedy, Simple Minds, The Shires, and many more.
And taken to the stage in Coventry, Billy Ocean, Paloma Faith, Eliza Carthy, and more.
4 nations, 4 locations. One amazing weekend of music. BBC Music presents the biggest weekend.
Beginning on Friday, the 25th of May.
Find out how to buy your tickets at bbc.co.uk/biggestweekend.
BBC News at 4 o'clock. One of the country's most senior counter-terrorism police officers could be sacked after he was found guilty of gross misconduct. Assistant Chief Constable Marcus Beale left classified documents in his car. They were stolen. Mr. Beale, the former head of the West Midlands Counter-Terrorism Unit, has already been fined by magistrates after admitting a breach of the Official Secrets Act. The founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, has lost the latest stage in his legal battle to have an arrest warrant against him quashed. A judge at Westminster Magistrates Court ruled it was in the public interest to pursue Mr. Assange. Lisa Hampley was in court.
The senior district judge told the Pack Court Julian Assange is a man who wants justice only if it's going in his favour. The WikiLeaks founder fled to the Ecuadorian embassy in London in 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden. Last week he lost an attempt to have his arrest warrant withdrawn because Sweden had dropped sex assault allegations against him. Now he's lost all 5 points his lawyers put to the court, arguing the warrant was not proportionate or in the interests of justice. Responding to an assertion that his time in the embassy was punishment enough, the judge said that unlike in prison, he could sit on the balcony, use social media, and he wasn't locked in at night.
The leadership of South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, has formally requested that Jacob Zuma stand down as the country's president. Mr. Zuma has indicated he'll respond tomorrow. The International Development Secretary, Penny Mordaunt, has said she won't rush into deciding whether to withdraw funding from Oxfam because of the controversy about staff using prostitutes in Haiti. She said she was taking the issue very seriously. The city watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, has been accused of completely losing control of a report on the mistreatment of small businesses by RBS. Maria Miller, who chairs the Commons Treasury Select Committee, made the comments after a copy of the confidential report was leaked online. BBC News.
The BBC breakfast presenter Steph McGovern and comedian Jade Adams discuss their favourite books with Harriet Gilbert in half an hour. Their choices: John Bronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed, The Seagull by Anne Cleves, part of the Vera series of course, and Postcards from the Edge, a semi-autobiographical novel by the late Star Wars star Carrie Fisher. We'll join that discussion on A Good Read at 4:30. First though, we join Michael Rosen for an extremely topical edition of Word of Mouth.
Gender identity has been in the news a great deal in the past few years. There's been a recent debate within the Labour Party around allowing trans women to stand on all-women shortlists. Donald Trump's attempt to ban transgender people from serving in the US military. To some extent, we've seen greater visibility for trans people with TV shows like Transparent and Boy Meets Girl. But a recent research report by YouGov and the charity Stonewall found that 2 in 5 trans people have experienced a hate crime or incident because of their gender identity in the last 12 months, which suggests that greater visibility doesn't always equal greater acceptance. Today on Word of Mouth, we're thinking about gender identity and language. What does it mean to be transgender, and how is language being used by and about people who identify as transgender, non-binary or genderqueer? With me as always in studio is Dr. Laura Wright.
Hello.
Laura, and our guest today is the writer and musician C.N. Lester, author of Trans Like Me, A Journey for All of Us. Thanks for being with us today, C.N.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, you're a singer, classical musician, songwriter, teacher, and then another big part of your work is activism, education around transgender rights. Can you tell us a bit more about your work and how language figures in that?
I think one of the most basic points when we start talking about activism and language is the idea that activists are pushing for some kind of odd language, something very PC, something new and a bit difficult. But coming right back down to it, the question of what language we use relates to how we see other people as equals, as a separate group or a group that could be part of our community. And that very basic level of acceptance of language, of using compassionate language, of using empathetic language, which understands somebody else's life experience and somebody else's viewpoint, really cuts to the heart of what my activism, I think, is about, which is that whether we're trans, whether we're bisexual, whether we have a different sort of economic background or a different cultural background, we want to be seen as equals, we want to be seen as fully human and appreciated for who we are, rather than the assumptions people make about us.
And just for clarity, so we're all reading from the same sheet here, when we talk about someone being transgender, what do we actually mean?
Well, we could mean an awful lot of things, depending on the background of the person using the term, depending on the year that we're using the term. At the moment, a lot of trans people, myself included, talk about the term trans as it's the broadest possible definition you could really give. So if we think about the trans umbrella, we think about people underneath that who in one way or another have moved away from the gender and sex they were assigned at birth. Now those people could be transvestites, those people could be what we traditionally say transsexual under a medical model. They might call themselves trans, their experiences might lead them to be there. But crucially, the reason they're under an umbrella is because they experienced some form of discrimination because they're gender non-conforming in some way.
What have you found are the common misconceptions that you encounter when talking to people about being transgender?
Well, one of the most interesting misconceptions, I think we're in LGBT History Month at the moment, and a huge misconception is that being trans is new. Even the word trans is not new, and this is the really fun part. If we look at the word transvestite, which originally had a much broader meaning than it does now, that was being used at the beginning of the sexology movement in Germany in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So in terms of trans as this modern community to identify a way of language, a way of linguistically challenging the binary genders around us, it's more than 100 years old already.
Just remind us of the acronym there that you used.
Oh, LGBT?
Yes.
LGBTQ?
Yeah, all of it. Just spell them out for us.
Oh, basically, it's a nice alphabet soup so that we don't have to say lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning. We can put I there for intersex, A for asexual. It really depends on what kind of group you're talking about, whether people want to be included or not. But a shorthand way of saying it would be people who are discriminated against because of their gender and sexuality.
I mean, you were certainly able to say the acronym. It just tripped off your tongue perfectly well. And of course, this is how acronyms grow up. It's shorthand by a group of insiders, people who need to repeat the phrase a lot, and it's a quick way of doing so. Trouble is with acronyms, if you don't know what they stand for, you know, they're mystifying, they're opaque to outsiders.
Just give us one or two other words in this field. I think I've got one or two here, but you can remind me.
So genderqueer is a word that I use about myself. I really like it. It came out of the queer movement in the 90s and also the queer theory movement in academia. And in that reading, queer isn't just a term that we've reclaimed because it was a slur used against us. It's that sense of queering something, sort of turning it on its side or looking at something a little bit, sort of, you know, cocking your head to one side and going, how could I reimagine that? How could I sort of turn that around? So
I meet that quite a lot in my sphere, in cultural studies and so on. But how does genderqueer work? Is it, as it were, that you are queering the notion of gender?
That's the
in other words, you're saying, let's rethink it and think of it in a different way.
That's absolutely it, yes. And it had a huge heyday in the 90s, and it was sort of late 1999, 2000 that I was coming out. So I had a huge moment of recognition with that word, which is why I like it so much. Non-binary is a term which has come into a lot more common usage in trans communities, probably in the last 5-10 years. Meaning someone who is outside of a gender binary. So if gender binary is male-female, and the crucial part of a binary being that it only has two, and those two are locked together. If someone is non-binary, they are somehow disrupting that, they're moving outside of it, they're saying, hang on a second, there's more to gender and there's more to sex in this.
And can't we date that also to Germany in the 1920s? There were films and people talking about this sort of thing.
We absolutely can.
Perhaps Marlene Dietrich being an example. I mean, maybe just jumping the gun here.
No, she's very, very much linked to the Weimar sort of underground, which was not only talking about ways in which culturally we could sort of leave sexual and gender binaries, but there were various different organizations working for the rights of people who were gender non-conforming. There was a move to get police cards that you could carry with you to say that you wouldn't be arrested, even though you were clearly falling outside of traditional gender roles. So yes, the people doing this. I think one of the earliest organization groups we had was in New York in the 1890s. But the term non-binary is a sort of newer term. You see words going in and out of fashion. So maybe it'll be with us for another 10 years, maybe not.
And you got one with a Latin bit.
Oh, cisgendered, right. So the idea of cis, or cisgender, is we've had the word trans in usage for a long time. And trans is a word, while it has been used by trans people ourselves, it was given to us by a sort of medical system. When we say cis and trans, it's the same way as really saying gay or straight. So it's not really enough as someone to be termed different by being saying, you know, I'm trans, without then having a sort of neutral term to explain how our experiences are different. So if I talk about my mother and I, for example, I let's say she's a cis woman and I'm a trans person. And a lot of our experiences are very similar. We have a huge number of overlaps, but I have medically transitioned in some ways. She hasn't. I've experienced transphobia when I go out in the street or in the job market. She hasn't. So it's just a way of pointing to this broad brush.
So what haven't quite followed the exact distinction that cis gives you?
So cis is someone who is not trans, basically.
It's the antonym.
It's the antonym, but rather than saying not trans, which has that very negative connotation, it's trying to find a more neutral term to explain.
So if you have gay and straight, that's their antonyms. So trans and cis would be antonyms.
You see, that's much more simple. I need to remember how to explain it like that.
Oh, I mean, it's actually quite a fluid term, and it's got a Latin history. Trans means across, and ultra means beyond, and well, in classical Latin I suppose it would be pronounced kiss, and in church Latin it would be chiss, and when it's borrowed into English before in a different context, usually in a physical context, it would be pronounced size. So you're giving it a specific pronunciation which you're claiming it for this usage, and it means this side of.
I love the ultra. I think I want to describe myself as ultra gender.
Oh well, then you're
I
beyond.
realize that's might be a little bit presumptuous.
No,
but
it's
it
a
sounds
very
quite
nice
exciting.
one. It's very nice. It's when you're in Spain, you'll see old-fashioned grocers have ultramarinos. This is things that have come from beyond the sea, beyond seas. Was the old way of expressing it. So if you're beyond gender, then you're ultra.
Well, I don't know if any of us are quite beyond gender yet. That sounds
maybe it's a goal.
Maybe it's a goal. I like it very much.
And why do you think some people find these words kind of awkward, or maybe they get anxious, sometimes angry? I've seen things online and so on about having to get their heads around these terms. So me being, I'm cis, aren't I? I'm on the other side, so I'm on this side, or wherever. Anyway, I'm somewhere. And it doesn't matter anyway. I'm quickly learning it doesn't really matter, so I'm progressing here. But why do you think people get angry about it?
I've seen two main reasons why people get angry. I think the first is really understandable for me, which is that a lot of us, particularly in Britain, we get that horrible, oh God, I'm going to mess it up, I'm getting so embarrassed, and you get so embarrassed that you don't even want to go near it, because better to sort of avoid it entirely rather than try and get it wrong. So I have seen an awful lot of that, particularly when I do training sessions or public speaking. People will say, I'm going to mess up, I'm going to mess up. And you say, come on, it's better to try than to try and fail and then try again and succeed.
I mean, as adults, we hate failing. Kids fail all the time, but as grown-ups, it's so embarrassing. Well, no, that's true.
But actually, it's one of the things I love being a musician. You can't be a musician and not fail. That's literally what you do all day, every single day. You practice for hours and hours and hours, and you fail and fail and fail, and then you get it right. And I would love to see people take the same approach with language. The second sort of source of anger, I think, is much more linked to the fact that trans people, as a group of people, as a sort of subject, are still really not accepted. There's a lot of anger there, there's a lot of dis-ease, there's a lot of sense that there's a great sense that we're pushing on boundaries that shouldn't be pushed on, and that we're overreaching ourselves and somehow destabilizing an awful lot of society. And I've certainly always found that when people say your language is too difficult, what they mean is that I'm too difficult. The phrase which you hear an awful lot is, all those words are made up. And I absolutely love that. Trans is a made-up word. They is a made-up pronoun. And you think, well, but language is made up.
Everyone is.
That's what we do. And it is a delegitimizing force, essentially.
Can I just come back to the anger point, which is that if we think that language contributes to the way in which we're defined, then from the age of 0 onwards, by and large, in culture, we do define people as male or female, and there are all these words, we'll go into some of them in a bit, all the she's and its and everything else, defining, but also the way in which we're handled. And the dominant mode is heterosexual binary.